Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Australia at Home. It feels like ages since we caught up, which I think it was actually only last Friday, but good to see you all back. Welcome for this discussion on an issue I'm not that experienced in, which is the benefits of silence. And I'm with my good friend, Christine Jackman, who's written a fantastic book called Turning Down the Noise. And we thought it was an opportunity to sort of have a chat about the journey Christine's been on. It's not all going to be holding crystals and talking about meditation. Like, there's a whole politics around noise and the politics of silence that we're looking forward to delving in. So, hi, Christine. Welcome to Australia at Home. Yeah, great to see you. Before we get cracking, as we always do, pay respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we're all meeting. I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I'm sure you'll join me in paying respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that the land that we're all on was never ceded. I'm not in my roof today because I woke up this morning and there was a jackhammer going next door, and I thought that wouldn't be really an appropriate backdrop for a discussion like the one we're having today. So I've come into the city, which is in Sydney, and our office is in a building at the end of Martin Place, between Martin and York Street. And it's beautiful, and it's empty, and it's a really quiet place today. So in the centre of the city to, I think, the suburbs of Brisbane. Christine, welcome. How's your day, and how's life up there?
Oh, well, actually, it's a gorgeous day, and I will acknowledge I'm on Turrbal land of the Turrbal people. And I am very, very grateful because we now live very consciously, decided to find a house that lives in as much nature as we can find without being too far from the city. And we actually live on a fauna reserve, only about 3 or 4 k's out of the city centre in Brisbane. We have a creek in our backyard, and last week I saw...
Is this what we're seeing behind your shoulder?
No, I'll be honest, that's disguising a very messy study. What's in front of me is a beautiful bush reserve. And then from this window last week, I firstly heard something that wasn't very peaceful, sounded like a massive pipe exploding, but it was actually a very, very, put it this way, a koala. It was filled with the joys of spring. They make a really...
2 koalas.
That I missed the action, but they do make a very, very powerful noise when they're in the mood. And it literally climbed down the tree out from the back deck in front of me and went off to find other ladies.
Very nice.
Yes.
And as you say in your book, particularly with nature, the calmness is in total silence. Probably not the sound of rutting koalas, but something somewhere.
No, but there is something. It's actually a pretty important concept to acknowledge up front, that there is a difference in the way human beings respond to man-made noise versus the noise of animals and nature and things like that. And for a while, very early on, and I might be skipping ahead of ourselves a bit, but I got obsessed with just decibels, and I carried a decibel meter on my phone because you can get them on an app. And eventually, because if you're by the ocean, for example, which is one of my favorite places to be, it can be really noisy, And I thought, this doesn't make sense. And eventually I realized that a lot of the people who study this area recognize that the noises of nature actually have our bodies process them in a different way, which makes sense because for most of human history, we've existed within nature. It's only relatively recently that we moved into built structures that are reasonably soundproofed and so forth.
Maybe we're a bit ahead of ourselves. I'd be lying if I said that I've come with a massive agenda just to kick around the ideas.
It's not like
your
you,
book.
Peter. Come along.
I didn't say, for those that might be friends and family of Christine or those that aren't regular here, use the chat, introduce yourself, ask questions. We love to bring people up from the audience into the room as we go. But, let's kick this off, Christine, just with, so you were a News Limited reporter. You were part of the Tribe. You were a New York correspondent for a while there. You've done big stories around the world. You've worked as a spin doctor. You've worked, I think, kind of in the the right-wing version of my company. So Crosby Textor are kind of the evil twin of Essential Media. And you've ended up writing a book really about calmness. So what was the journey? Like, what got you into this place where you thought the most pressing story to tell was really one that is about stripping back the words and the excitement?
Yeah, as I say in the book, I wish I had one simple light bulb moment that I had, that suddenly wisdom, landed on my shoulders, and I realized what was going on. But it was more of a journey, as much as I don't really like that word. It's a bit overused. There's a chronic reason, and then there was a catalyst. The chronic reason was that I had basically done what, somebody who works in communications is supposed to do, which is climb the ladder, headhunted out of journalism, went to work for Crosby Textor, as you mentioned, and then went in-house with one of our clients, Business Council. And, I was making great money, and we were living in, the so-called leafy North Shore of Sydney. I could run by Sydney Harbour from Neutral Bay every morning. So, from the outside, we were living the dream. And I'm guessing there's a few people here who know what a lie that is, the living the dream thing. And so I just couldn't, for a long time, I couldn't understand, I'm supposed to be enjoying this. This is supposed to be great. And yet I was chronically unwell. I had awful insomnia, just this sinus infection that I could never lose. I was never able to see my friends. I had heaps of friends in Sydney because I'd worked in the Canberra Press Gallery as well. But I was spending my weekends, if I could get them, recovering from the big job. But the big job was one of those jobs that, infiltrates every hour of your day. I use the shorthand of saying, I was one of those people with two phones. You're really successful when you have two phones. You must be really, really important. And I was on call, spoke to politicians, ministers, CEOs of big companies all the time, the whole schmear. And yet I was just really unwell and really unhappy. It got to the point where I'd walk into the front door in the evening and just hearing my children, not because they were being, naughty or aggressive or anything like that, but just hearing their voices sort of grated physically, like somebody shining a bright light in your eyes. And looking back, that's because I was just so raw and overstimulated that I just needed to lie down in a very dark room. And I found myself saying regularly, it's so noisy, but not really knowing what that meant, hence the obsession with decibel meter. And I had all sorts of health checks, and mostly they said I was fine, of the conventional type. And then the catalyst, when I really started to think I've got to change what I'm doing here, is firstly, we were good friends with Mark Colvin, ABC, beloved ABC host of PM. And in the end, he went very suddenly. We knew he was ill, and then he thought he was getting better. And so my partner and I were with him the morning he died. And I walked out of the hospital that morning, and it was a beautiful autumn day in Sydney. And he'd just left us, and I walked out and thought, right, well, I have to go back to work now. And that was brutal enough. We didn't expect that to happen that morning. And then 3 weeks later, my father was diagnosed with advanced melanoma. And I thank Mark just regularly, because going through that with Mark, or that small slice of experiencing that with Mark, was enough to alert me to the fact that if I didn't turn down the noise in my life, if I didn't take out lots of stimuli, and if I didn't start making really deliberate decisions, Dad would be out of my life at some point permanently. And it was up to me to decide what to do. I think that's the thing a lot of us just forget sometimes, because we're on that hamster wheel. I've said before, to people that are former colleagues of mine, in news, you know, Rupert Murdoch's not going to come up to you and tap you on the shoulder and go, listen, you've been working so hard, you know, have a break, go and enjoy your kids before they finish school and leave you, or go and look after your elderly mother. It doesn't work like that. You have to stand back sometimes and go, why am I doing this again? And why do I feel so overwhelmed? And start, you know, breaking that down, which is what the book tried to do for me.
You write beautifully about the passing of your father and the notion of silence. It brought up a bit for me. My dad passed about 5 years ago, and I remember in those last weeks in the hospital, when you're just sitting with somebody, I've got memories of pulling out the laptop and doing emails just because I felt I had to. Like, what a horrible memory. Yeah, it's just that sense of inserting ourselves in a world where almost by automation, we're increasing the commitments and the things we feel are really important and things we need. And what I like about your book is that it kind of challenges you to look at techniques of stripping some of that stuff back. And particularly, you know, you did an intervention on yourself, which was to go and be quiet for a while. So I'm interested in that process. And for somebody like, I assume you're kind of similar to me, like to be in the center of most important conversations. Yeah. Like, what was it like shutting up for 10 days? Wow.
Well, before I went to the 10-day one, early on, I call it reverse parking into silence, because I was like you. It didn't occur to me that what I needed was silence. But then I went on a very short retreat at Gwingana, the health retreat up here in Queensland. And when I rang to book, I mean, they often ask you questions like, you know, you're vegetarian, do you smoke? What's your issue? Why, you know? And I just said, you know, all good with that. I'm all fine, you know, whatever. But and then out of the blue, I just said, oh, can I not talk? And I don't know what, and they, bless their hearts, they told me later that they get people, a lot of, you know, busy execs and things like that who come and who are completely depleted. So that was actually not surprising to them, but it was surprising to me. But and also very, as I put it for the Gen Ys, you know, hashtag awkward, hashtag orcs, because I work in communications. I work in the world of words and communicating. But of course, the petrol was just, probably because of that, I had nothing left to give.
Yeah. So, well, there is one rule of communications that I often tell people I work for, which is sometimes saying nothing is a strategy. So maybe.
Absolutely. And look, Peter, again, we're probably going to dance all over the place in this conversation. So let's do it. But there is a beautiful quote that I think I used in the book towards the end from a Christian, it was a priest, not a monk, Henry Nouwen. And he says, first, silence makes us pilgrims, meaning, you know, often we go searching for something. Then silence guards the fire. And I see that as, you know, replenishing ourselves, thinking what's most important and how do we stoke that. But then he says, third, silence teaches us how to speak. And that was so important to me, because I realized towards the end of my experience of a journey that I could go back into the public world. And indeed, you know, at a time like this, when there are so many things that we need people to be, you know, climate justice, those sorts of things, we need people speaking up. It wasn't about withdrawing from the world, going and living in a cave, or, you know, just running away from the world, which I can't do anyway because I've got 2 teenage kids, so I'm not going to get very far. It was about recognizing that exactly what you just said, which is that, you know, silence is a really important way of us getting our thoughts together, of grounding ourselves, and then hopefully adding quality to what we do in the world. I mean, just imagine, wouldn't it be great if more of our politicians had a little bit more of that time rather than the 24/7 cycle of, you know, engaging on Twitter?
Well, as we've also said, there's no business model in saying nothing at the moment. But no. Let's go back to your journey. Yes, sorry to jump all over the place.
That's okay.
So you're in your first retreat. You've taken your vow of silence, and it's all a bit awkward.
Yeah, yeah, that one was, it's an interesting thing because that retreat, that was a health retreat. Everybody else was able to talk. Yeah, so I was the only one who was wearing a little badge saying in silence. And I'd been at a yoga retreat years before in India, where I had been the person who was able to speak, and other people were in silent retreats. And it's actually a weirder experience in some ways than the retreats you go on where everyone is committed to silence, where you at least all know the rules of the road, right? You know what you got to do and what you don't do. When people are around you are talking, it was actually really interesting for me because very quickly I realized that you can quiet, because Gwyngarn is a lovely retreat. This isn't an ad, but anyway, because it's up in the mountains of the Gold Coast hinterland. You can see the Pacific Ocean, there's koalas and birds and all sorts of things. So it's a very quiet place, apart from, people doing their retreaty things. But very quickly I discovered that, oh, isn't this blissful? And then two things kicked in. One, I got a massive caffeine withdrawal headache. But more importantly, I very quickly noticed that the noise in your head, you can reduce the noise around you, and that's really important. That's part of it. But that if you can't deal with the noise in your head, little voices telling you, oh, you're an idiot, what are you doing? Or this is just indulgent, or all those people over there at that other table eating their quinoa porridge, they think you're an idiot, all that stuff that we carry around us and we have, possibly since childhood. You have what the Buddhists call the monkey mind. That's, and other psychologists will call the inner critic, or whatever your thing is. Or if it's just, God, I wish I had chocolate right now, or I wish I'd brought gin in my bag. And of course, this is somewhat humbling to me that I wasn't having some massive insight by discovering that. If you go back to the early centuries, BC, 5th BC, I think. Rome was at its height. I may be getting that date wrong, but Rome was at the height of Roman civilization. Rome was where it's at. Everybody, who's anybody lives in Rome, and there's wine, women, and song, and it's great. And at that point, there were a group of early Christians who said, we shouldn't be living this way. It's getting us away from what our true purpose is. And we're going to go and live in the desert. And they became known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And the interesting thing about that is that, very quickly, you started seeing writings coming out of those folks saying the same thing, which is, you can first silence those things around you, but it's important to, silence the mind so that the demons can't mess with you. There's lots of talks about demons, which is, again, the voices in your head, right? So I hadn't really discovered anything just that hadn't been thought about before. But I would say one thing, and there's one thing to read about this stuff, it's another thing to do it. And that's so after the experience in Gwyngarn, and I'll say that at the very end of that period, which was I didn't even know what I was doing. I was just playing with it. I was just giving myself permission to go, you know what, just see what happens. And again, that's actually a big principle of meditation, as it turns out, or a certain form of meditation. But at the time I was just, if it feels good, go for a slow walk in the sun. Don't hurry. And at the very end of that 4 days, I remember standing at the head of a trail looking down through, I think it's the Talabudra Valley out to the Pacific Ocean. And it was I just had this moment or a few minutes of just feeling for the first time in ages healthy and happy. I could feel sunshine. I could hear with clarity, dog barking down on the farm below and birds, and I could smell sort of the loamy earth around me and things like that. And I was hooked there. I just thought, I don't know what this is, and I don't know how transportable it is. I don't know how it's going to work in my modern life, but I need more of this. And I literally told them that I was going to quit my job, and I and I think I'm going to write a book about this. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to write a book about it. And that was about 2 years ago.
Fantastic. That notion of clarity that comes once you sort of take all those blankets off you, I guess, is, and what I like is that you don't, there is an interesting telling of your experience and looking at those sort of traditions of silence, the Benedictines, obviously the Buddhists, but it's not, you don't need to join a movement to embrace that, those principles and find that.
Yeah, that's really important. I just, little asterisks there. I think it's worth noting. Yeah, when I said I was going to write a book about it, I also knew, just from a journalistic perspective, and it wasn't it's not my first rodeo with the old book. I knew how I'd have to, because I'd written political books before. I thought, for me anyway, while this will have a degree of my personal experience in it, I really wanted to investigate, what is this? I don't want to just be saying, oh, this feels good, it's so woo-woo, this is great. I really wanted to investigate, what do we know about noise, both the two elements of noise that are the sort of external noise, the jackhammers that you were describing earlier, things like that, noise at work, and the internal noise, the stuff that can't be measured with decibels, but that I think of as noise pollution, which is the incoming digital noise that we experience. What do we know about that and what it's doing to us? And then, this is where the silence comes in. Most of us are probably not going to ever be able to completely remove noise from our lives. And so what can we do? Are there things we can do to turn down the noise? And what does the science say about that? What does the science say? And that's what leads to things like meditation and nature and things like that. But I was very committed, Peter, to not just going with the feels, but investigating what science and there's an amazing array of science now coming out in the last 10 to 15 years about, what happens with our brain because of the leaps and bounds of neuroscience have been amazing in this field.
There's some lovely comments coming through in the chat. Gwen was talking about when her husband had passed, she asked for 2 weeks of solitude just to do the grieving. Sue's been talking about the techniques of clearing the mind, and Robin talking about how lockdown hasn't been much of a problem for her because the silence has been something she's embraced. Everyone obviously comes at this with different objectives and different needs, but I think one thing that unifies us all is that if you do make those decisions, you actually are in a position where you're challenging business as usual. Business as usual, whether it be that we all carry around these bloody things that bounce and ping and vibrate and tell us that we're missing out on something. Obviously, when you work in certain professions, you are expected 24/7, which is a ridiculous concept to actually be giving people considered. But more than that, I think, and that would all be fine in itself, and that would be a challenge. But the extra element that just gets me is that the business models now are to make that harder to put away. So the business models that say that, this platform wants to extract as much information as it can, so it's in their interest to keep you on producing data for us, for our kids, that sense, particularly for my teenage boy, that if he's not on a device, then what am I going to do? It is the default. So it's not just the training to quieten the mind. It's actually going to require almost a sense of resistance to a model that has been set up to keep our minds noisy.
Yeah, and it is really tricky, isn't it? And one of the ways I've tried to challenge some of that, because we will get resistance, is to ask questions like, does anybody really think we're doing better creative work or better strategic work, more thoughtful work with all of this noise in our lives? I don't know about you, but I found myself towards the end, before I left my big job, last big job, was that it was considered sacrilege to have your office calendar not completely filled. You know, my EA sidled up to me early on in that job and said, oh, you know, you don't have things in your calendar. And I was like, coming from a journalistic background, particularly, or even as a consultant with CT, it was like, you know, it's none of your business. You know, what I'm working, it's what I'm doing. But there was this mentality that work had to involve meetings, phone calls, you know, noise, right? And I found it a constant battle to just go, you know what, block this out. And I'm going to say, this is my, you know, writing or strategic planning afternoon, and nobody touches it. And, you know, I was fortunate that I was at a level where I could do that. Not everybody can. But I think it's worth us starting to think about that. I mean, if anybody can tell me that you do better work, constantly running on adrenaline and you know, 24/7 availability. I think I tell the story in the book. I like this story, and I've had some good feedback about it. But I had brought in a very excellent candidate to be my 2IC early on in that job. I'd worked with him in the Canberra Press Gallery, highly regarded, very bright young man. Knew he had the capacity to do this job. And we interviewed him. And I had to have two other execs from the organisation in the first interview. And they met him, and we did the half-hour interview with the thinking that if they liked him, he'd go on to meet the CEO. And I walked about, I thought, he's aced this interview, but for the one thing, what he would do is before he answered a question, he would pause. And these were tricky questions. This was, you know, policy and you know, lobbying and all that sort of thing, and political strategy type stuff. I walked him out to the lift thinking, well, he's nailed that. And I walked back into the room and said to my, you know, colleagues, well, what did you think? And they were like, oh, wow, he was, you know, he's great. He knows so much. It's amazing. But he can't do that in an interview. And I said, what do you mean? What can't he do? He can't pause. When he's asked a question, he can't pause. And I'd actually timed the pauses because I was interested in that. He would pause for maybe 5 to 8 seconds. So it is long enough to be noticeable. But I thought about it and I thought, have we really got to a stage where we're seeking complex strategic thinking that we can't afford, you know, maybe a minute over our 30-minute interview, that we think we're all so important and doing such dreadfully important work that pausing before you speak is a deal breaker. And as I say in the book, I think there's probably only a handful of jobs where we actually genuinely do need that instantaneous reactivity. I mean, if you're close personal protection for the Prime Minister, or if you're a heart surgeon, or, you know, they're emergency worker, yes, you probably, or an air traffic controller. But most of us that do what you do, Peter, or what I do, or, you know, you're actually paid for your thoughtful, you know, that creativity and thoughtfulness and experience. And I think it actually cheapens things.
It strikes me that that all that sort of, so particularly the public square, to the extent it exists, is fragmented and is, the news cycle is no longer daily, it's hourly. Tweets are instantaneous, and there's this whole thing that's coming, and everything is a knee-jerk reaction, which I totally agree. It's an enemy of clear strategic thinking, but worse than that, it keeps fueling and makes it faster because everyone goes to their initial instinct and impulse. And I think you particularly see that in the way a lot of political debates and tribal debates play out, because without the time to reflect, you jump straight into your default position. And so it's not just individuals that are being overtaken with noise. It feels to me that it's the entire of the systems that we've created to mediate our society.
Yeah, and as you know,
overrun by noise. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And as you touched on earlier, the algorithms behind these things that are driven by the attention economy, about grabbing every last little flicker of synapses in our brains, you know, they're not seeking anything, any creative output from us at all. What they're designed to do is just keep us locked and scrolling, you know, and you and I probably, I mean, this stuff is so familiar to me that sometimes I forget that it's not broadly talked about, although we're starting to hear more about it. But, you know, for example, people will push back when I say this about social media particularly and say, oh, you know, that's a sort of Luddite way of thinking. We've always had disruptors. We've had radio. People said it was the end of the world when we had TV. But the difference, I would say, is that none of those things were 24/7. Oh, I suppose radio is. But back in the day when you and I grew up, it was Saturday morning cartoons and that's it. And the end of, but more importantly, it wasn't a two-way street. It was, here's what you're getting served up next, and here's what you're getting served up next, and then there's this. And if you don't like, you know, the young doctors or the news or whatever that your parents like, then you go off and do something else. But now we have this, in the last 10 to 12 years, this explosion of content that's always available, but is also designed, as you know, that it's a two-way thing in that you are feeding back information into that
about what
machine
you like,
about what you like, or what keeps, more importantly, what keeps your attention. So it's actually may not be what you like. It might be.
You don't even get the credits anymore. It's already scrolling into what's next. If you're on a Netflix or if you're on a YouTube, it's reacting, you know, take the next.
Two quick examples of that. I mean, the Netflix CEO, and this is the scary thing, the heads of these businesses do not hide this. This is out in plain sight. Head of Netflix was asked a couple of years ago what were his competitors, you know, was it YouTube, was it other streaming services? And he actually said, we're beyond that point. What we're competing with now is sleep. Which, when you think about it, if you have children particularly, or if for colleagues, yeah, we are shaving our healthy sleep off because we're hooked on what's coming up next. And I think that has an impact on overall levels of anxiety and depression that we're seeing in society, because people are overtired, overstimulated, and underslept. But the other piece, you know, of evidence I'd throw at you would be, again, out there, I think 2017, 2018, the head of YouTube said that 70% now of all of the videos watched were actually the result of the user being suggested, you know, that well, you might want to watch this next. So basically what that means is, you know, a vast majority of the content, it's roughly 700 million hours a day of content on YouTube is watched, not because somebody was going there looking for it. Oh, I think I want to find out about this, but because the YouTube algorithm said, and now you might want to watch this next. And then we can go into a much more technical discussion.
And each algorithm is testing whether that one works, and then moving on to the next one until something works.
Yes, and and this goes to the way something like Twitter particularly works, because they all work differently depending on what sort of content is the main, you know, the other main inputs. But we do know that the things that are most effective are things that spark anger, fear, the negative emotions. And also, interestingly, the stuff that's new and novel, which is why there's been some interesting research in the US that went really deeply into the Boston Marathon, how Twitter worked after the Boston Marathon bombings, because the researchers were thinking, well, this should probably show how great social media is for sharing information about what's actually going on quickly in a real-time disaster or emergency. But what they found instead is the stuff that got spread faster and went, you know, that was both shared and then engaged with more, was the stuff that was both frightening or making you angry and outraged. The sort of, you know, this is a, you know, fundamentalist people at work, but also the new and the novel. So fake news. Yeah, if you keep telling people the same material, which is essentially, as you'd know, what good policy making is all about, you don't keep changing your evidence and your position. You have to keep dealing with the facts. You're not going to get the traction that something is, something that's crazy and new and different is going to get.
Which the phenomenon of Trump was just the end point to that, which is loud, new, divisive. Like that's algorithmic gold. And even it's going to be really interesting to watch whether politics can wean itself off that model or whether it adapts and tries to, like there's all this talk that the Republicans without Trump's craziness will keep doing what they're doing. And in a way, a kind of Biden politics of compromise and bringing people together, under Obama, it was like he wanted to be no drama Obama. It doesn't actually work on the algorithm. So how, and I guess I'm thinking out loud, how do you take the principles of stripping back the noise and finding clarity that you've talked about in different ways into a system? And particularly, and again, I go back to the fact that it is not in an empty system where you're just saying we choose to do this while you're fighting against the biggest, most powerful businesses on earth who want to make the exact opposite happen. Like it's a really wicked little
problem.
Yeah, isn't it? Hey, there's a few questions in the chat, and I don't know, Afsa, we had was it Anne that just had a question specifically about meditation? I think I skirted over that because Anne doesn't want to ask it out loud, but I'll ask it for her. What suggestions do you have about ensuring one has more quiet in your life in the everyday context?
Yeah, great question. And because I was very determined to make this practical to as many people as possible, rather than to say, that's fine, Anne, off you go to a 10-day Vipassana retreat like I did. Yeah. And so at the end of the book, I divided up a section into what's called slivers of silence, slices of silence, and slabs of silence, meaning, recognizing that sometimes you're only going to get a little tiny piece of time. And that may be all you get for that day. I've been in that situation where I was a full-time single parent of 2 boys, both of whom were in nappies when we first separated. And even then I wanted to go to a Vipassana retreat, but I knew that was not going to happen. It took me more than 10 years to get to one. Slivers of silence are things like just actually inserting a pause between your tasks at work. I probably came up with a nice title for this in the book because, I'm a journalist, so I had little subtitles for each of these, but I can't remember what they were. But the practice is, and research backs this up, if you move from, say, I'm working on a media release or a spreadsheet or whatever your task is, and then now I've got a meeting, I've got to go. If you move straight from one thing to another, your brain, the researcher who looked into this described it as a bit like having multiple tabs open on your computer. They're still there. Your brain is still working on that tab, right?
Oh, yeah.
Draining the energy, draining your battery.
And I never shut down my computer.
Oh, God. Yeah, I don't know why we're having this conversation, Peter Lewis.
I know. It's aspirational on my part.
Yeah. But you could do this, taking, it can be less than a minute, putting a full stop or a pause between each task, noting this is where I'm up to and this is where I will come back to before you move on to the next task. So it gives your poor brain a break. Oh, okay, I'm finished that for the moment. Or another one I suggested, I think I call it the car pod of silence. I, unlike everybody else, or most people in COVID, I had been working at home. And then when COVID started, I went into an in-house gig working with a hospital that was coordinating a lot of international research on COVID in ICU. So suddenly I was back commuting, and I found myself really quickly getting irritable because all of my routines had been thrown out, right? and just arriving at work already sort of heightened and fractious. And then one day I was in the car park at the hospital and I thought, hang on, I wrote a book about this. Moment of humility. I'm supposed to be an expert in this. So two things that you can use in that sort of commute environment, or dropping the kids off and then having to go to work or wherever. Carpod of silence. Just turn everything off. Turn your music off. Turn your podcasts off. Turn your phone off. Don't use your car for that moment for returning calls. And either drive in silence or sit in the car park, as I used to do, for a couple of minutes and just breathe. And if it helps because you're not comfortable just breathing, note, in your head, the sky is, cloudy today. I see that bird. Anything that just brings you down back into your body.
Well, as Ron says, this used to be called the Siggy break.
Yeah.
Like that. And think about it, like you would breathe deeply, particularly at the point at which you couldn't do it at your desk anymore and you had to go out in the street. Like that was actually like, so discuss the death of the Siggy break has actually added to the noise, hasn't it?
Yeah, may have saved a few lives, but yes, has killed a few. Here's another one. Actually, a listener, a talkback listener suggested this one, which is when you go to the toilet, leave your phone at your desk. Because I know there's people scrolling through in the cubicle.
People matter on your, yes.
Yeah. Some other ones are things like if you have a problem with your phone, grayscale it. If you've got an iPhone, that means pressing the little button on the right-hand side 3 times, and it will take all of the color out of your phone. And you will notice almost immediately how much less attractive it is to engage with it. If you've got a different type of phone, just Google grayscale. Very easy to convert back. You just tap 3 times again. But that breaks the, this is a pretty thing, like a poker machine, lots of bright lights and dings. One I like at lunchtime, which I'd probably be in the slices of silence, daily things if you can get there. Rather than just duck out and go to, if you're working in the city, and go to the nearest food court, grab your food, come back and sit at your desk. Or wherever. I used to call it a quiet quest. Go out into the city, maybe just do it once a week at a lunch break, and set yourself the challenge of finding somewhere quiet, some part of the city that is actually a little quiet spot that you didn't know. And it can actually be quite fun. And I encourage people to have fun with these sorts of things, right? It doesn't have to be this noble monastic task. So, for example, here, there's the State Library of Queensland. Apart from the fact that there are people quietly working inside, it's this beautiful environment of light and air and river views. And so there's all sorts of little nooks and crannies around there where you can just sit and eat your lunch and watch water lizards come up and want to eat your lunch with you and things like that. But it's just breaking your own routine, getting out into maybe hopefully some sunshine. Another place you can go, most churches are open during the day, and that might feel a bit unusual to you, but if you walk into a church and sit quietly, not during a mass or whatever, but just sit there, that's what they're there for. And that can be a complete circuit breaker because physically your senses will feel differently. You're in a quiet, darkened place. I've even sat in a church when I had a family member in hospital. I'd walk down to a church down the road and actually listen to a meditation on my phone in a church, just because it was a soothing, quiet place to be. But ideally, I usually suggest don't necessarily take it.
What do we think about meditation apps and doing digital silence?
I would say I definitely think, because I should say the neuroscience now on meditation generally is so good, is so remarkable, that if I said to you, there's something you can do, it's free, you don't have to buy special Lycra gear to do it, you don't have to go somewhere full of other people wearing Lycra to do it, you can do it in your... that it will improve your attention, it will improve your heart, your blood pressure, it will potentially improve creativity. It lowers, all your inflamed immunity. And this is all being picked up by science now. Dose related, you need to do more build up, but as much as 6 or 8 minutes will start having good impacts. And this is peer reviewed science, not the junk science. You do it. But all it is meditation. Now, but I realize that meditation is quite a confronting thing for lots of people. So where I go with that is to say, there are heaps of good free apps or apps that have a premium version and a free version. Calm, Headspace, Insight Meditation, Dan Harris, 10% Happier. All of them they're worth delving into if you're just wanting to do 10 minutes and you don't know how. I would definitely say to people, you don't have to pay a lot of money to learn how to meditate. There are places out there that will tell you do, you don't. And if you're really interested, the Vipassana or the Buddhist type meditation, the monasteries, they don't proselytize. They will take all comers. And if you want to do a day retreat, you will not have somebody saying, here, sign up and be a Buddhist. You can build up that way. But the apps at the beginning, I think are actually good, because I'm not against technology. I'm against, technology.
Immersive.
Yeah, that we don't, immersive technology that we're not thinking about. It's a bit like saying you can have, back in the day, sure, you can have fast food. When I was growing up, once a month on a Sunday night, we got fast food. That's different from having it every day, so it's the same thing. And if you use your technology mindfully for specific things, then it's a great way to learn how to do this thing. And the other thing I'd add with technology, where are we thinking about it? If you go into nature, Peter Lewis, walking your dog or walking on your own, do not take your earphones and listen to something. Be present to it.
So part of my working from home, we're on the edge of Callan Park, which is a big old disused mental hospital where people used to be healed. In fact, there's these buildings on the water that World War I vets that came back with shell shock lived there until the 80s. It's really beautiful, but I do catch myself, particularly over the last couple of months. So in this beautiful environment, listening to another American podcast about whether or not Trump would win, and it kind of does defeat the purpose of the exercise. But I must say so Zoom is really intense. So my world now is do this, have meetings, and then go for a walk and break away from it. So that sense of not always being on, yes, but also not always being potting either. Hey, there were a couple of other comments. I feel like I've been dominating everything. There was Remy that had a really interesting comment. Are you still there, Remy? Would you like to say hello to Christine? You might have missed the moment. AFSA will let me know.
Actually, hi. Really, your reference to slivers and slabs, which I love, the idea of different amounts of silence and meditation, and I was just wanting reflection on. There's so many different ways, like sitting silently by yourself or walking in nature, but also going and sitting in a group that's being silent, where everybody's breathing, which is certainly a Buddhist setting would be available to that. But it's quite powerful when there's silence with a lot of people. Because, it's reinforcing that it's okay.
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
Fill it up. And then just the other options, chanting and then being quiet, and so you've been speaking to my question over the last 10 minutes or so. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
We also had Gabrielle, who was talking about living in a quieter community. Are you still there, Gabrielle?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I was just, I live now in a very quiet spot. I find quiet spaces, but I lived on an island for many, many years in East Timor where I was working. And it occurs to me that not only the silence and the natural sounds, but the space we had was very important to quiet and serenity. It was a community where everyone knew each other, people worked together, people played together. We didn't have a lot of interference from the outside world. Probably it was the opposite to globalization. And it was a very quiet and serene time, which was very good for my heart and soul.
Mm.
Any question?
I think, Christine, the learning of the health benefits of a lifestyle that's played out at a gentler pace is kind of still coming. Like you've had a go at pulling some of that together, but it's still, it feels to me that just like it took us years and years to realize that smoking was bad for us, God damn it, we're going to come to a conclusion that this lifestyle is also, that there are health consequences. And I think what's interesting is we only actually started regulating cigarettes when there was legal cases against employers for occupational health and safety in hotels and that sort of thing. So it's interesting to think how the next sort of decade plays out as we become more and more aware of the impact of noise, what are going to be the triggers, if there are going to be, to sort of quieten the place down.
Mm. And I think we will start, as we've talked about it, we'll probably start seeing that first in what the impact it's having on kids. I mean, it's frightening to think that we have wholesale brought in screens and devices into, they've just taken over schools, they've taken over, you know, every part of our children's lives, right? And, you know, there is, I'm getting on a little bit of a hobby horse, but there's no research. I know because I've looked for it. There is no sound research to say that kids engaging at school on a laptop or on an iPad all day, that it's going to improve their outcomes. And
it really makes them dumber. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you only have to talk to parents to recognize the, you know, plethora of problems, whether it's that they're not actually learning, they're just cutting and pasting, or they're not engaging with the stuff, they're just tapping in, or that they come home, as my kids are now at, and, you know, we're told we need to monitor how much time they spend on it, but you can't distinguish between whether they're doing homework that they have to do on their laptop or what else they're doing, because that is frankly impossible. As I've said in another forum that we've done, it's a bit like our schools have said, here, your child, this is a poker machine, and it's okay though, because they can do their homework on it. So they're not supposed to use the poker part of it. They just have to do their homework on it, and it's going to sit in your kid's bedroom. And you have to make sure that they're doing their homework on it, but not doing the wings and dings and the gambling part of it. But it's fine, because that's the way, you know, because the poker machine company sold it to us and said this is a great way for the kids to learn. And that is the other thing, you know, it's taken over our curricula because Microsoft and Apple and all of the other guys.
Vendor driven.
Yeah. I think that is where we're first going to start seeing a real pushback. I hope. Unfortunately, it may be too late for some kids, because the fact is we don't have the research. It's a bit like, imagine, to use the smoking analogy, you know, it took a while for us to get the research that said smoking's bad for you. But in the meantime, we weren't handing out cigarettes to sort of 6-year-olds to say, here, smoke this, it's great, you'll feel better. You know, we waited to get the research, whereas with, you know, with devices that are handed out in school, we now don't even, or are required, we now don't even have, as parents, the ability to really say, no, that's not what I want. I don't want them having to be engaged on a screen all day. And I think that's really troubling.
Yes, as you've also said in that other forum, where we're doing some work with some health experts and some advocates around kids and technology, it's that sense of desperation in homes. And what I love about the opening up of the conversation you've done with this book, Christine, is you place it into a broader context, because for a lot of people, the technology is just too hard to frame. Like we've spent a lot, you know, modernism is all about saying that technology is part of advance and it's going to move us forward, and our kids will be smarter than we are and they'll be more prosperous than we are. but to bring in almost something so obvious as noise and silence just sort of, I feel, opens up the whole debate in a really constructive way where we can actually imagine something different. So you brought out the calm in me today, and it's been a lovely discussion, and there's been fantastic comments. So if you have not bought this book, AFSA will put a link in the, oh no, we said we're not going to put a link for a click because we want you to go and support your local bookshop. So this is Christine's book, Turn Down the Noise, The Quiet Power of Silence in a Busy Room. Good luck with it. And, isn't it the classic that us bloviators, like there isn't, our job's to fill up the spaces and talk, but it's been lovely talking to you about this over the last hour, Christine.
Thanks, Peter, it was great.
For our for the crew, we don't do many 2 days in a row, but we've got our fortnightly tech talk tomorrow. Lizzie O'Shea, got a guy called Simon Carter who's been doing really interesting work on the way cities and buildings collect our personal information and data. And we've got some of the kids at Monash Uni who have been doing some research into the privacy of kids who are doing their education online, and then what the privacy implications of that are. So a whole bunch of interesting issues tomorrow for Tech Talk. But on that note, it's almost up at the hour. It's why don't we end 2 minutes early and everyone just have a bit of quiet reflection?
That's perfect.
On that note.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thanks, Peter. Namaste.